Order number 4, sir.
Order number 4.
Order number 4, in the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Child Justice Bill 2024.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I too want to join you in welcoming back to the Honourable the Senate the members of the Youth Parliament. They've been here with us before. We have hosted them in this chamber, and we have had the opportunity to interact with them, and I have every confidence that they are the future of Parliament and parliamentary debate in Barbados, and I am very much looking forward, God willing, to be in a position to observe them speaking from one of these microphones or those in the other place. So welcome to the Honourable the Senate again. Mr. President, I rise with the members of the Youth Parliament here with us to speak about a matter that perhaps is on the opposite side of the spectrum. It covers young people, younger than themselves, but perhaps some of them in the same age category under age 18, as represented in the draft of the Child Justice Bill. The Child Justice Bill, Mr. President, is a piece of legislation that perhaps whose time has long past due and whose time has finally come. Mr. President, as I go through my presentation, I'm going to cover, first of all, the philosophy of this government, why this legislation is important. I'm going to cover, Mr. President, the legislation itself, and I'm going to then cover, Mr. President, the additional pieces of legislation that bind together our philosophy as a government and as a people with our work as legislators, Mr. President. And so, as I get into that third section of my presentation, you will hear me speak more and more about the correlations between the Child Justice Bill, the work on the Child Protection Bill, the work of the Child Care Board and all of the related agencies, and the work more broadly of the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs under the leadership of their minister and all of the well-equipped officers who work there, Mr. President. But let me start first of all by going back to the philosophy of this government. This government, Mr. President, came to office with a mandate for being the representative voice of all people. It has always represented, Mr. President, all people, those who have, who feel as though their voice have agency and those that do not. And one of the very early issues, Mr. President, that we found ourselves confronted with is that relating to children and to youth, and in particular, over successive administrations, how we were seeing young people who felt disenfranchised from governance and from their own nation, feeling as though they had no alternative pathways, Mr. President. What am I talking about when I say that, Mr. President? You have seen this government pilot perhaps the very first, most comprehensive approach to education sector reform. And why would we have done that, Mr. President? Why would a government have taken and made the commitment to a full reform of our education sector? Because, Mr. President, and I have said it before on more than one occasion, in multiple fora, before I was a member of a government and since I have been a member of government, our education sector, education system, is not and has not been for a long time fit for purpose. Our education system, Mr. President, has created, in my view, and I am on record, so I do not retreat from it, and it is something that we have said, perhaps even more recently now, as we just come under the common entrance. I have not been a supporter, Mr. President. Never have I been, publicly or otherwise, a supporter of the common entrance system. I am on record in this very chamber, Mr. President, as saying I believe that the common entrance system and its structure, taking children from primary to secondary, has been an experiment in social sifting. I have said on more than one occasion, Mr. President, that the common entrance system and the system as it is currently structured favors people like me, favors those of us who sit in this honorable chamber, those of us who are academically gifted, those of us who are meant to be on an academic pathway, those who are meant to be future professionals in one way, shape, or form. But it relegates young people from the tender age of 11 to second-class status. It tells you that you are either going on an academic track by going to certain schools, or you are going to something else by going to different schools, doing the identical, for the most part, curriculum, but just being taught at a level that is lower. I am on record as well, Mr. President, in this very chamber, as having said, I went to the St. Michael's School. I have supported the St. Michael's School because it has been a part of who I have been. It has helped to form me. It has helped to frame me. But I have said that my mother worked as the principal secretary at the St. George Secondary School for all my life. I went from St. George Primary to St. Michael's, but I spent all of my holidays at St. George Secondary School with my mother. Every lessons teacher I ever had has come from the St. George Secondary School for the most part. And when St. Michael's ended at 2:15 when the evenings came, I left St. Michael's and I went to St. George Secondary. I lived a parallel existence. I saw children in the St. George Secondary School with my mother who excelled in areas that they would dust me out in a heartbeat. I can't touch them. Put me in a classroom with them with English or math or history or those subjects, they have nothing on me. But I've also been on record as saying, who makes me, the academic, better than they are in their own areas of skills? And it is not about giving people more time. It is not about teaching them later. It is not about giving them a chance to develop on its own. It is a structural problem that has had social consequences. And what are those social consequences, Mr. President? We have had generations of young people leaving school with few certifications, feeling excluded from their own country, feeling excluded from their own society. And as a result, many of them feel as though they have nothing to lose. What has resulted is a cycle that is connected then to our social system, to our labor market, Mr. President, and ultimately, in some instances, you have a lot of people who make exemplars of themselves and who go on to do extremely well. In all kinds of disciplines. Technical disciplines, vocational disciplines, yes, and academic disciplines when they find their pathways. But we have seen people who have come through the system who have nonetheless, and despite our system, and I don't say they have thrived because of it, they have thrived despite it. So this is a government, Mr. President, that has said, we are not satisfied with even one child, far less the thousands who have passed through generations upon generations upon generations, who have felt excluded from our country, from our society, from feeling as though they have a right to be. We have said as a government that the starting point for this has to be a complete reconstruction of the education sector from primary through secondary, and we have extended it now to make sure that there's provision for pre-primary. We have made the commitment, Mr. President, that because no other government prior to this administration has tackled it in this comprehensive way, that is not something that can be rushed. And while some may want to politicize it for reasons of their own and oversimplify it, we leave them with that, Mr. President. But the reality of it is that this government has made the decision to take its time and do that which must be done in education well, with all of the stakeholders sitting at the table, by engaging with all of the partners so that the outcome benefits all Barbadians. The rationale, Mr. President, for us being in a position to do that body of work is to make sure that not only are we equipping every child for greatness and making sure that every child feels as though they are a star, but that every child then has a pathway that they have crafted for themselves. But it fundamentally also, Mr. President, is about a changing of minds and hearts. Changing of minds and hearts. I had the opportunity to speak with the principal of one of the entities that will be designated in here as a secure residential facility by this legislation, and I will come to the legislation in the second part of my presentation. And in so doing, the principal said to me, what they see is that a lot of these kids that enter the facility between ages 12 and currently now up to 16, that these kids come with anger. They come with this anger that cannot be explained. They come with this anger at the world and at all kinds of things. And they don't know why. And when you start to interrogate to find out what is causing this anger, somebody look at me bad. They got beef with somebody because she passed and didn't speak to me, or she passed and I don't like how she look at me. All kinds of things that, for most of us in this room, are foolishness. But under the wrong circumstances, then that finds its way in the criminal justice system. And we see More often than not, and regrettably, a cadre of young people, and I've said this here as well in this honorable chamber, I am the mother of a 24-year-old, soon to be 25 in September. And I remember when she was in secondary school, she always used to talk about the fact that in the court pages always had young people who didn't look that different from her in terms of age. They were all her same age, and she couldn't understand how these kids were finding themselves in front of the justice system. This legislation, Mr. President, as I go from philosophy to the legislation itself, this legislation attempts to capture the philosophy of a government that believes in inclusion, a government that believes in people, a government that believes that everyone deserves a chance to be, a chance to thrive, a chance to excel, and a chance to be seen and heard. That is the philosophy of this government. So how does it then find itself colliding with the actual legislation itself, Mr. President? In the legislation, you have, in the other place, Mr. President, you have the House of Assembly referring the legislation in draft as a bill to a joint standing committee on the social sector and environment. That joint select committee constituted members of this honorable chamber and that of the other members of the other place, and it was open to the public. It was open to the public, Mr. President, because again, the philosophy of this government is about inclusion. It is about giving people an opportunity to be heard and to be seen. It is about the opportunity, whether you have contending views or not, to be able to put those views on the table, and where there are merits, that those merits can be incorporated. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that that standing committee made a series of recommendations to the legislation, which I will come to, but I will go through the primary legislation first. Mr. President, the Child Justice Bill, as it stands now, has a number of sections captured in it. It was developed out of the work of a cabinet subcommittee led by the Ministry of Home Affairs, and they had the benefit of a consultant coming from UNICEF. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and so Children Education Fund. And so they then led a 3-month consultancy with the ministry to be able to look at the Child Justice Bill, and also in parallel to look at the Child Protection Bill, Mr. President. As a consequence of the Cabinet's directives and the work of the Ministerial Subcommittee, and then the work of the UNICEF consulting team, we now have a bill before us for consideration. And I will go through, as I start the second part of my presentation, the bill itself. The bill, Mr. President, is premised first and foremost throughout its text on what I have outlined in my first elements of the presentation: our philosophy as a people, our philosophy as a government, those principles about all children mattering, all children needing to be seen and heard. That is the premise of the bill. It also, Mr. President, is based on a number of multilateral considerations that come from the external community. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Administration of Juvenile Justice, they're called anecdotally the Beijing Rules, the United Nations Rules for the Protection of Juveniles Deprived of Their Liberty, and the United Nations Guidelines for the Prevention of Juvenile Delinquency, otherwise known as the Riyadh Guidelines. So, Mr. President, as you begin to see the framing of it, first philosophy, second, multilateral guidelines, and you're beginning to then start to dissect how and why the legislation, the bill which is before us, is framed in this way. It looks first at the rights of the child. It looks at children in terms of human rights, the human rights of children. And then it talks about the administrative standards for administrative justice for juveniles. So you're making sure that at all times it is fair, it is fit for purpose, it is well suited to children. Then, Mr. President, we talk about when we cross the Rubicon and we end up now interfacing with the justice system, what do you do in terms of protecting juveniles deprived of their liberty? And then ultimately, Mr. President, even before you get there, you have the prevention mechanisms. The child protection legislation, Mr. President, as it is now called, it has passed through both houses of Parliament, is meant to deal with everything that comes before. Children before they have to interact with the juvenile justice system. Children before as a preventative mechanism. Children before to be able to ensure that they don't find themselves involved in the justice system. It is meant to keep them from where we are now. If all efforts have failed, Mr. President, and if despite everyone's best efforts, and when I say everyone, in this circumstance, Mr. President, I am not speaking about everyone, namely the government, the child care board, the welfare officers, the teachers, the whoever. I am not talking about those everyones. Those everyones are included, yes, but when everyone has failed also includes mother, father, uncle, aunt, grandmother, great aunt, the person who lives next to you, who know you since you're born, and who should be in a position to correct you when they see you going in the wrong way. Sunday school teachers, because you should be going to Sunday school when the Sunday mornings come, or some faith-based to give you a sense that there's something bigger than you, and you are not God. We're talking about the everyones that includes a society raising its young and making sure that we are gifting a society a future and not creating challenges for ourselves a little later. The everyone finds itself interfacing upfront by way of child protection, and then afterwards, there's a role for those same everyones, if all else fails, in child justice. So the application of the Act is meant to deal with a child who has actually committed an offense and who, at the time of the commission of that offense, is under age 18. Under age 18. And then you have, I'm going to go through the legislation itself. What is the part 1, which is what I just spoke about. Part 2 then covers the assessment of a child. What do we need to be able to do when that child first interacts with the system? But then I'm going to go into part 3, Mr. President, the assessment of the child, and part 4 as well, securing attendance of the child at the initial inquiry, Mr. President. We have a somewhat well-established criminal justice system for children, how they are processed, apprehended, and processed through, assessed, first of all, and then how they go through the criminal justice system in the country. And we want to make sure that a child under 12 years old is not covered in this legislation. So children under age 12 are seen in this legislation at the minimum. The bill provides for the minimum age of criminal responsibility so that a child under the age of 12 is not capable of committing a criminal offense. That's the first element that I want to raise. Then we start to talk about perhaps where philosophy and the everyone's that I spoke about and the legislation also intersect. It is a section that deals, Mr. President, with diversion. When we talk about diversion, Mr. President, believe me when I tell you that this legislation contemplates that everything that possibly can be done to keep a child out of the criminal justice system is meant to be done under this legislation to take a child along a different pathway. And what does that mean, Mr. President? It outlines a range of things. It speaks about, Mr. President, the purposes of diversion. I've just given a high-level view of that. A child to be considered for diversion under certain circumstances. Levels of diversion options. It gives you every possible opportunity to avoid taking that child through a criminal justice system. It then also, however, as is the nature of rearing children and life in general, actions have consequences. And in order to talk you down from the limb, we want you to be able to say, all right, you know what? I should not have done what I did. I was angry. I was feeling unheard and unseen. My home environment is a challenge for me in this way. My mother maybe do me this, or my father maybe do me that, or I may not have parents and I'm struggling on my own. I have interacted with the system because my own social circumstances are so challenging that I may need some help. When that child under age 18, as covered in the legislation, comes to that right conclusion that I may need some help and I am willing to, 1, accept responsibility for my actions, 2, go along a different pathway captured under the legislation defined as diversion, then you're able to successfully divert. It is in circumstances where, Mr. President, when diversion fails, then you have a consistent, almost escalation of how the legislation works. Then you find yourself dealing with court proceedings, and you find yourself before the court. The court has a couple of options available to you, and that's one of the areas that I will come to now in the legislation, because the legislation identifies in parts 10 and 11 a couple of things that I want to spend a moment on. One, a secure residential facility. Let's deal first with that. What is a secure residential facility? And what we historically would have known as the government industrial school is going to be defined once this legislation has been successful. If it has been successful through this honorable chamber, the government industrial school will then be defined as a secure residential facility. Now, I want to spend a moment on that, Mr. President, because this government, in the last estimates of expenditure, which we would have debated in this honorable chamber, has allocated approximately $3 million in this financial year for the purpose of renovating the government industrial school in St. Philip, and to ensure that we're able to deal with what is happening in the building. Mr. President, the building that currently houses the government industrial school was built in the 19th century. It is an extremely old building, 1897 or something like that, I believe, is when the building was constructed. Very old, and if you know that old building, those are old soft stone buildings, much like this one, and I know the honorable member, Senator King, would know this very well. So it is an old building, and so you're constantly in need of renovations, constantly in need of pumping money into that facility. This year, $3 million have already been allocated. I'm advised by the facility, Mr. President, that they have already laid the foundation to begin the process of moving the principal, the deputy principal, as well as the accounting and administrative staff out of the building into temporary office accommodation in order to allow for those renovations to take place in earnest. That work is underway, Mr. President, in the interest of making sure that we have a genuinely secure residential facility in a building that is fit for purpose. So in that facility, Mr. President, you have a range of things which are meant to happen. I'm advised also, Mr. President, and I'm proud to be in a position to share this with the Honorable Chamber, that they are well underway with ensuring that children in their care benefit from not just the existing curriculum, but that the facility has now been designated as a certified CVQ facility. Previously, this is the vocational qualification, Mr. President, and that previously the students who were there, the children who were there, had to be entered through other facilities, Springer Memorial, Queens College, whomever else to do their subjects. Now the facility itself has been so designated as of last year, and the resources provided to ensure that they can deliver on the courses. They are providing courses, Mr. President, in carpentry, masonry, English. You have children who are doing their CXCs. Before, Mr. President, as you would recall, and Senator King would know this, the age at which children went in or came out, the years would have been, typically the sentence would have been 3 years or somewhere thereabouts, and children would remain there until their 16th birthday or just before, and then they would be released depending on what the offense was at the time. Now, the facility will be a secure residential facility. It covers up to the age that we have spoken about, Mr. President, but we are seeing sentences now, I am told, in the vicinity of 18 months with a possibility for review, which gives that child an opportunity not to spend their entire time in a facility, but to have a chance at genuine reintegration. And that brings me to the other element that I want to speak with, which is just that, reintegration. Mr. President, everybody knows somebody who was in a facility of some kind. Whether it is Big Persons Prison, whether it's in what we, in my time, it used to be Somerville and Dodds, whether it is in government industrial school, whether it is in rehab, everybody knows somebody who was in a facility. It's a small society. Some of us may not, but everybody knows somebody, I think. Even if it is by secondhand information, you may know somebody. And it is hard, Mr. President, it is hard. It is hard to get Barbadians to accept that people have fallen and they can get back up. Mr. President, it's hard. The minute that you hear this boy went in jail, you don't want no cutting your grass no more. You don't want no working around your house no more, Mr. President. The minute that you hear that they went in jail and they're running an electrical business, you don't want them to come and fix you lights no more, Mr. President. But if we don't give people who have genuinely rehabilitated and been rehabilitated, submitted to the discipline of a facility that we have set up to say, I take responsibility for what I have done. It was my fault. I needed to do better. I am willing to do and be better. If we don't give them a chance, Mr. President, no, I am not saying to you or to me, myself, all right, if you are a bandit, you are committed to being a bandit all your life, then perhaps society may not be in a position to say, okay, I can give you a chance because you have demonstrated a lack of responsibility and personal accountability. But for people who are willing to try, Mr. President, I am saying grace. Grace. For many of us, the saying there, but for the grace of God go I. If I was raised in a different environment, Mr. President, if I was raised by different parents, if I was raised in a different community, there but for the grace go I. Mr. President, I went to primary school. I didn't go to public primary school. I didn't go to private primary school. And the Reverend is going to speak, I'm sure, in his time. But this is true. We're both, as a matter of fact. I'm not in that, y'all. But one of them married me, so I hope he's real. but the point that I'm trying to make, this is true.
A very important distinction.
One performed my marriage ceremony, correct. But I think, Mr. President, the fact of the matter is here now that we have to be that society that gives people grace. I want to take the opportunity to say this. On my phone, you see this device that we have here? Sometimes I just want to pelt my phone out through the window. Honestly, I actually have come to the conclusion in my ripe old age, I don't like phones that much. Don't say anything, Mr. President. I don't like phones that much. At this stage of my life, I have accepted I don't. We spend too much time down in these devices, seeing all kinds of things that are inconsequential, hearing and receiving information on things that have, in some instances, nothing to do with us. So that body that we don't know, that get in an accident up the road, why do you have to see them if they have passed on the ground? What is wrong with you? Why? Somebody got shot. Unless I am law enforcement, I actually don't need to see it. I don't. But this notion that you in 1,001 group chats and everything that happens in the country you want to see, and you subscribe to all of these news, gossip, information sites on social media because you want to see everything. I am saying you are a part of the problem. I'm telling you. And you know why, Mr. President? I grew up in a generation where there's nobody that I know who has not fallen. I know Gregory Nichols since I was 11 years old. He was a bandit all the time. He's a bandit now. But the point I'm making, Mr. President, is that in the era in which Gregory, Senator Nichols, and I grew up, the people who you see today standing here have fallen over time. And with God's grace, we have gotten back up. And we have been able to be restored in some instances, to be forgiven in other instances, and to be redeemed in other instances, and to be allowed to live and thrive and be. I am saying that there's no one I know, from the highest boardroom to the smallest back room, every one of us lived in a time where everything was not recorded on these devices for perpetuity. We lived in an era where we were allowed to fall and get back up without it being captured on video. We fell and got back up in a time where, Mr. President, where everybody, instead of rushing to help us, paused to pull out their phone to record us. I'm saying it to young people who are sitting in this chamber today. We lived in a generation where we were able to become versions of our best selves because we did not live in an era. We did not come up and grow up in an era where social media or people's minds felt that the first thing they needed to do was to record it on their phones. We went to fetes and dances and shows. I went to Mona Campus. I lived in Jamaica as a student for 3 years on Urban Hall. I swear to God, if half of it was recorded, honestly, it was not recorded. It was not. We went to every dance, every show, every fete, Mr. President, everything, everything we went to, without these being there to record it all. I am saying to you, give people who have fallen an opportunity to get back up and to have grace extended to them. Give young people in particular who have fallen and gotten back up an opportunity to have grace. This legislation gives young people an opportunity by way of the reintegration provisions, by way of the establishment of a reintegration board, by way of a child protection board. It gives young people an opportunity for reintegration. I do not want us to look at this legislation as pure legalese. I don't want us to look at this legislation except in the light that I outlined earlier, a philosophy that focuses on people. People having an opportunity to be their best selves, to live and thrive, but in so doing, to fall and to get back up. So, Mr. President, this legislation in Part 5 speaks about diversion. It covers the opportunity, Mr. President, as well, to keep children out of the system. It ensures, Mr. President, in Part 8, that children have access to legal representation, and one of the things that's important in the legislation as it is contemplated, that not only will children have legal representation as provided by the state, but that they must be spoken with. No, I say spoken with, not spoken to. They must be spoken with in a way that they would understand, so that they understand what is before them. It goes on, and as I mentioned, to speak about the secure residential facility, Mr. President, and the section that I was just referring to, which is Part 11 on reintegration, the establishment of the reintegration board, the functions of the reintegration board, and how that is meant to be supported. Then, Mr. President, it covers a couple of key things that I want to focus on here in terms of the interaction in my last section, the interaction between the Child Justice Bill and the Child Protection Bill. Mr. President, as I mentioned before, these things must go together. And sometimes a child is not bad just because a child is bad. One of the things about this legislation, Mr. President, is that it introduces the concept of parental accountability. I have said I am the mother of a 24, almost 25-year-old, and I was quite happy to see one of my colleagues look at me sideways. Thank you. But yes, I don't cede responsibility to anybody for raising my child. And I don't mean that in terms of, you can't tell my child nothing. That's not what I mean. I mean that I feel as if it is my responsibility as a parent to gift society a child that everyone can look at with some degree of responsibility and to say, she had a responsible parent. We have, Mr. President, a generation, perhaps it's been societal, and I believe that the Honorable Deputy President has spoken about it very recently, who themselves lack accountability and who their parents don't know what is accountable. How many times have we heard, Mr. President, about schools having to put parents off the compound because they come and want to fight with teachers? They want to beat teachers. Don't tell my child nothing. Don't discipline my child. Not abuse, don't discipline my child. And you have parents who will come to the school, and if they can't come into the school, Lord help you. That is something for which somebody will for sure pull out their cell phone and record the cussing down that will take place perhaps outside of the school compound in front of the entrance of the school. Skin out your clothes, get on bad, carry somebody there. All kinds of things have happened. When you are dealing with a child, Mr. President, I always used to say to my daughter, don't watch And the boy on TV, you know, don't watch superstars, don't watch models, don't watch them. You watch me. Because what you see on TV and what you see in a photo in a single moment of time or in a video is not real. Social media, even for all of our lives, is not real. I actually don't like social media, for the most part. I post occasionally on Instagram. I don't have Facebook again. I never had Twitter. I don't know what X is. I've heard about it, but here is a replacement for Twitter. I don't know what TikTok is. I've heard about it, but I don't have it. Because, Mr. President, after a while, overconsumption of too much information and all kind of esoteric things, I feel as though I start to lose a couple of brain cells as I consume too much of it. So I curate what I see, I curate what I consume, because after a while, if it is not positive, if it is not developmental, if it is not beneficial, if it is not progressive, I don't need to consume it, Mr. President. Think about my coffee cup. Everybody knows I always got a coffee cup close by. It's a standard thing for me. Imagine filling up my coffee cup, Mr. President, with brine. And every time I turn, I fill it up 3/4 ways with brine. And only the rest of the way, a quarter of the way, I actually get my coffee or my tea. I am choosing that my cup must be filled with that which is good. I am not taking up space in my cup with things which don't add value. So I curate what I see, what I hear, what environments I put myself into. I curate it almost perhaps slavishly because my cup must not have things in it. I must not consume from my cup things which are not beneficial to me, things that will not help society through me. I purposed in my heart that I'm not doing it. So I say here, Mr. President, that when we start to deal with accountability for parents, parents have to understand that what you pour into a child, if it is predominantly good, that is what comes back out. If you pour in abuse, cursing, drugs, neglect, all kinds of things, that is what will come out a lot of times, Mr. President. And so we have to pour into the cups that are our children that which we want to come back out, and what we want to come back out must be that which is good and beneficial to a collective community and a collective society. And that is why this legislation, Mr. President, holds parents accountable. It includes a provision in here, Mr. President, under administrative penalties where a parent is accountable for the things that they can be found culpable when their child is before the court. So when you go and mash up the people brand new buses, and you friends record it, and you go home and you parents say, not my child, okay, no problem. Let me sort this out. You are responsible. And so the way in which the legislation is meant to interact is meant to provide for full-on accountability. Accountability by the child up until the point where we can divert them away from the court system, taking responsibility in a healthy way. Once you have interfaced with the system, then you are going to be dealing with how to make sure that you are protecting the rights of that child, even in the justice system. You're going to then be dealing with how to reintegrate them into the facility, how to support them once they leave the facility, how to support them when they're in the secure residential facility, Mr. President, and then ultimately to make sure that we are gifting our children and supporting our children, those who are the most vulnerable a lot of times among us, with a chance to live, to be seen, to be heard, and ultimately, Mr. President, to thrive. This is what this legislation is about. The government, in the way in which it has treated to it, has created a report. The report has been laid in Parliament. It is available for all to see. It captures the child protection legislation. It captures the child justice legislation. It captures the recommendations made by the Standing Committee. The Standing Committee's recommendations are captured in the matrix coming out of the committee. There are just 2 pages of recommendations, the majority of which have been integrated into the draft of the bill, which is before us. And so, Mr. President, I am confident that this is a start. I'm not suggesting that it is the be-all and the end-all. It is certainly not the end. This is perhaps the most comprehensive body of work for child protection and child justice that has been done in this country for decades. We have heard in the other place, the Honourable Minister, with responsibility for the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, speak about the reforms that will take place on the child protection side. And you've heard the work being done with the Child Care Board, the creation of a social services agency that is comprehensive in its treatment and its dealing with these matters, Mr. President. And I am confident that children, all children, children come from all walks of life, can be supported first through the child protection legislation, protecting the rights of the child, and if, God forbid, they find their way into the justice system, that the child justice legislation, as it's drafted, gives an opportunity for those rights to still be protected and those children to still have the benefit of grace. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Watson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, like Senator Cummings, I wish to make some reference to the big event this week, and that, of course, is, well, before tomorrow, but more importantly than tomorrow, I believe, is to congratulate all of the Barbadian children who sat the 11+ exam, who put their all in and who did their best. And Mr. President, I raise that because year after year after year, I am perturbed by how we continue to respond to common entrance results. I'm not talking about reform at the moment, but I'm talking about how we respond as a society. And Mr. President, in particular, how the media responds. I follow an educator in Barbados on one of those social media platforms that the Honorable Senator just says she rather not engage with. But you can get some good stuff over there. For example, Senator Nichols is a blogger. He said that in here, that he blogs on cricket in particular. And so you can find some things that are worthwhile looking at. You do oftentimes get some good information. You meet people that way. And this particular educator, every year, bigs up his students, and his students are diverse in terms of ability and social background. And I get excited. I look out for it every year. And Mr. President, I'm asking that you allow me to read one of this year's posts. And I spoke to that educator directly. And if you will permit me, I will name that educator. I think it's really important. I would like everybody to go and look. Akil Eiffel of the Eiffel School, Eiffel Lessons, has said this year about a particular student. And I'm going to cite this with his permission because oftentimes he deals with students who are very challenged. And at the end of the common entrance, he says, this is what they have done, and this is the school they're going to. And those schools are across the spectrum, and that is what I like about it. Our media and our government, when it does its report, does not say this student improved their performance over their primary school experience and is going to this school, and that is a good thing. And that's what we need to do. We need to make all of our children feel that when they get that result, when they open that slip, what they are doing is patting themselves on the back for completing one phase. And I'm talking about society. We need to make the children feel this way, because it's not just parents, because when these children walk around and people say to them what school you're going to, if you don't call certain names, they are made to feel like they are less than, and that is not okay, and it has to stop. And that is on all of us, all of us. And these children need to pat themselves on the back, and they need to say, phase 2. This is just another step. That's what I tell mine. It's just another step to you achieving a goal that you set for your life. That is how we need to look at it. If it were up to me, we'd eliminate all of these fake stages, Mr. President, and have a system that lets children go through the educational system. They are tested for ability, not tested for separation and classification. That is what we need to do with our educational system. I have to say, based on what is promised, we're not going to stop that, but we need to stop it. Mr. President, this is what was said by Mr. Eiffel. Last year, I received a call from a parent asking about lessons for her daughter, which was followed by a message or two with information regarding the child. She let me know that her daughter was in class 4 and that she was having difficulty with aspects of her English and mathematics. The mother, let me leave out that part. On November 10th, they lost their home to fire. They lost everything, every single thing. It was a difficult time, yet every time I saw this woman at lessons, she smiled, she kept trotting on. That student was understandably distracted, and at the end of the first term, the improvement she made previously could not be seen. She was struggling with her English and essay aspects of the exam. She wasn't focused. She had a quiet anger. She wasn't still. Christmas camp passed, and it was now the beginning of the second term, and I wasn't seeing my student at lessons. After a call, her mom reached out and informed me that she was moving again from one part of the island, but informed me she would be coming the next time. I'm just going to paraphrase this part. They had a loss in the family, and that too rocked that child. And Ms. Eiffel goes on to say, Easter was approaching. We had a very popular Easter camp for 11+ students, and once again, she wanted the student to attend. When she came to camp, my focus was simple: make her laugh. And this is a reflection on her sorrow, because a relative very near and dear to her, her grandmother, had been ill. She was present in the home, and the child had to bear that experience. My focus was simple: make her laugh. She didn't have an attitude, but she wasn't her normal self, and I tried to lift her spirit. Sometimes teaching isn't about putting anything on a screen or giving a note. Sometimes it isn't even about explaining a difficult topic. Listening. Just listen to your child and your students. I asked her how she was feeling, and we sat and talked. She spoke about her feelings regarding the house being burnt, losing everything, and then losing her grandmother. A few days later at camp, she went to a nearby shop to collect some food, which she and another student ordered. A teacher/employee, who I believe to be attached to a private school not too far away, started asking her weird questions like, who is her mother? Who is her father? How does Ms. Eiffel teach? This individual started to make her uncomfortable by asking further ridiculous questions, and ironically, I arrived at the end of it. She was annoyed, but she dealt with it like a professional. I came in like the father I am, was very protective. I called both parents and informed them that they should report the matter to the police. I protect my students as if they were my own. If one feel like there's been making up these things, I'm quoting, ask the parent, ask them. I mention all of the above to say, this young lady is going to be someone great. She has the strength, the resilience, and the maturity of someone who has been through it. She has been through it. She will be misunderstood at times, but I want her new teachers to understand that she has been through more than most. Please be patient with her. Her mother called me moments ago, unaware that I was writing this, and informed me that she will be attending the Leicester Vaughan School. She told me that she scored 89 in English and an A in an essay. I am so proud you have come so far. Look, I ain't gonna lie, I had tears in my eye, man, because I know what that meant to her and her mom. It wasn't about the school, it was about the journey. When I made the change to the graphic to add the school crest, because he adds the school crest to all of these posts, I scrolled through the WhatsApp to ensure that my memory was accurate as it related to the details and the truth of this post. To the student, keep your head down and focus on your work. There are individuals who are out there who will want to see you fail. Do not be derailed. Stay out of trouble. You have a bright future, and it is at secondary school that you must leave with something. Make your grandmom proud, because I know that is what she would have wanted. Mom, I know many nights you cried, and I could hear it in your voice, but you never ever showed it. How you managed through all of that is, I have no words. Many others learn from you. May others learn from you. I know that it still isn't easy, we are proud of you. Keep growing. Mr. President, I want to say from this chamber to all of the students moving on to secondary school in Barbados in September, we are proud of you. Keep growing. This is about growth, and that's what we need to help our children to understand, every last one of them. And so we come to ask this question: is our educational system serving us? Ministry statistics this year are sobering. Our performance levels are dropping. In an environment where we have to compete in the world. If a child spends 7 years at primary school, Mr. President, and emerges not numeric or not literate, and we do not address that as a matter of urgency, what place are we giving them in our society? And we are not improving for the talk of transformation and being fit for purpose. Maybe the question is, what purpose does this, and frankly other administrations, have for our children? Are they only to be laborers, Mr. President? Are they only to be contributors to the national insurance? It has a new name. I'm going to call it national insurance because that's what we know it as. Either by producing more children or by contributing money. That can't be it. So we have to be doing better. And I start that way because all of these considerations impact what happens to send a child through our justice system. Senator Cummins made similar references. And we cannot examine this bill without examining our community and the factors that are contributing to children appearing in our criminal justice system, Mr. President. And so I want to orient my contribution in a study conducted by the Barbados government, which resulted in a report submitted to the director of the Criminal Justice Research and Planning Unit in the Office of the Attorney General of Barbados, authored by Dwayne Devonish, PhD, a social research consultant who resides here, and published on October 2018, titled A Comprehensive Qualitative Research Study Assessing Crime and Violence in At-Risk Communities in Barbados. Now, there are several objectives for the study, as I could pull from the study. And two of the principal objectives were to examine the primary risk factors, facilitating conditions and determinants for the high levels of crime and violence within key at-risk communities in Barbados, and ascertaining the principal consequences and effects associated with the high level of crime and violence in those communities. I'm not going to refer to those communities, Mr. President. They're listed in the study, and an explanation of how they were selected is contained in the study also. But what I reflect on, Mr. President, are the findings. And Dr. Devonish states, the 8 high crime communities selected for the study were observed to share similar profile characteristics with each other, including pockets of economic deprivation and or poverty. In the high-risk communities in the study, pockets of deprivation and poverty manifested in modest to high proportions of residents. In conditions of chronic unemployment and underemployment, low income, low education levels, unskilled or low skill status, high household density, poor sanitation, unkempt environments, etc. A second characteristic was low income housing. This characteristic involves the presence of government-owned housing units and or housing stock with inferior or poor infrastructural designs. The third that I will mention is concentrated, unemployed, unskilled youth operating on blocks, again, in these communities. Mr. President, I also canvassed the observations of another Barbadian academic that reinforces outputs from the previously referred to study. And in youth crime in Barbados, the way forward from a social justice perspective, author, Barbadian academic Marissa Chandler cites the following top 10 factors contributing to crime and delinquency in Barbados: anger issues, lack of money, father not involved in my life, hanging on the blocks, disrespect from persons in society, unemployment, meaning no job, desire for money, being part of a gang, peer pressure, substance or drug abuse, lack of parental guidance, family member involvement in crime. And the author states, to determine the factors that contribute to youth crime and delinquency in Barbados, youth were asked to identify the factors that they believed contributed the most to their engagement in crime or delinquency. The most identified factors were anger issues, 55.6%, lack of money, 53, and that would be respondents, 53.3%, absence of a father, 44.4%, hanging out on the blocks, 40%, and disrespect from persons in society, 35.6%. The author's conclusions are very attractive. I'm going to try to speed through them, Mr. President, but I invite the members of the Senate to read this study because it's actually very well written, it's very good, and it has some interesting observations. The author says, as expected, the research...
You will make the document of the House, of course.
Yes, I will. I will have to formally do that, Mr. President. I don't have it present. Unfortunately, Mr. President, we do a lot of things from these things now, trying to save some costs. I don't know if we have the facility of having things printed, but I will present it, Mr. President. Most certainly I will. And I think it's important because we have a lot of young people doing research in this country, Mr. President. I'm going to mention a young person that did some very interesting research that I've never heard mentioned, but I looked around a lot during COVID when we were grappling with the idea of anti-vax mentality. And there's a young academic who resides in Canada, schooled here, resides in Canada, who had done a lot of that research before in Barbados, particularly in relation to our vaccine programs, or normal, but HPV in particular. And there were some very interesting findings. Anti-vaccine didn't start, mentality didn't start with COVID. It started a bit before that. And it would do us well to consider what she says are the reasons: lack of trust, some of it grounded in post-slavery, social and psychological impacts, Mr. President. We don't trust authorities, that's essentially what it is. No. As expected, I quote, as expected, the research findings confirmed what was stated in the literature. Youth crime is multidisciplinary and hence requires a multidisciplinary approach. The most identified contributing factors to youth crime were anger issues, lack of money, absence of a father, hanging out on the blocks, and disrespect from persons in society. Additionally, over 3/4 of the sample selected at least one economic factor, while personal or individual and social factors were the next most chosen category of responses. Results also indicated that over half of the sample had been a perpetrator or a victim of bullying in the past, while a similar percentage presented some form of personal trauma in their lives prior to engaging in crime or delinquency. Many organizations have embarked on various steps to address the multidisciplinary causes of youth crime and delinquency by adopting direct, indirect, and early intervention approaches combined with several family, community, school, and economic initiatives. However, the potential link between personal traumas and crime or delinquency also indicate the need for psychological interventions that allow such traumas to be adequately addressed. Additionally, better implementation, streamlining, and collaboration is needed across the board to ensure that all youth crime prevention and reduction initiatives complement rather than compete, and that any new initiatives plug gaps that might exist in program and service delivery. Furthermore, the multidisciplinary approach to youth crime and delinquency needs to move beyond the individual and treat the system in a multidisciplinary fashion. Currently, these efforts are being undermined by a culture that historically marginalizes and renders youth powerless, and an environment that lacks the systems and processes in place to foster participatory parity among all youth, including those at risk. In investigating participatory parity in Barbados, it became evident that even though there is some level of engagement with youth, especially as it relates to program and policy development, this engagement tends to be limited to the most easily accessible and articulate youth. This can indirectly contribute to increased marginalization of youth and further inhibit participatory parity. Engagement first needs to involve all youth, especially those involved and affected by youth crime. Research has shown that this type of involvement of youth can enhance the effectiveness of programs and services, and by extension policy, but also bear in tremendous individual benefits for the youth themselves. Thus, it is critical that safe spaces be provided to ensure that all youth are at least given the opportunity to address issues that directly impact them. The main takeaway from this study is that using Fraser's approach to social justice to inform a more multidisciplinary approach to youth crime reduction and prevention cannot be done solely at the individual level. The system, whether that be legislative and regulatory environment, the judicial system, or even social service provision in Barbados, needs significant reform and intervention. And that there, but refer to one other reflection of the author. And this is a 2023 study, Mr. President. So it is recent, it's fresh. And the author refers to these bills.
All right, and this is the same study?
Same study.
Right, okay.
The author refers to the criminal justice bill having been tabled, and the child justice bill and the child protection bill, 2023. 2018 was the previous study. This is the second one, a dissertation. So that author was aware of what we are doing. There may have been some changes, but that author looked at those and made this comment. We have to look at the family law issues and the treatment of family law issues in our courts and establish a system specific to those issues, Mr. President. And this is why I recommend this study, because the reflections are pertinent to us today, but pertinent generally to how we approach this as the term she uses is multifaceted and multidisciplinary in a holistic fashion. And she cautions against doing things in silos, Mr. President. Research for decades, unquote, Mr. President, I move on. Research for decades and the world over has shown that there is a relationship between poverty and juvenile delinquency. And, Mr. President, I found when we debated the Child Protection Bill, there were some comments made by an honorable senator regarding how poverty affects parenting. That caused me concern, because children don't raise themselves. And if parents are affected by poverty, necessarily the child will be. They will be affected by that parent's inability to address, to be, I don't know, what we think is a good parent. Because the research also demonstrates that poverty affects the quality of parenting. That's not absolute. And nobody says it will or it must. What we're saying is that it does. And that is clear from research across decades, Mr. President. And those comments concern me because they, in my view, they ignore the reality for many families in our community. And where financial hardships can increase the risk, and that's what the studies look at. They say the risk increases. You can have interventions, but the risk is what it is. It presents itself, and it can only be mitigated if direct efforts are made to mitigate it. And it's not going to come from a parent that doesn't know better. They have to be taught better. That's where we talk about psychological interventions. We talk about interventions at the social level, at the justice level, that is not just about applying the law, but also providing other facilities to teach parents to help them through difficult times, etc. Examples of the hardships that families may face will include suffering economically and not being able to provide adequate care. This affects children. We heard about children being affected at risk because they're affected by low income housing, poor living conditions, lack of money in the family, etc. There may be only one active parent who's financially contributing. Again, that will result in some of the things that were identified by Dr. Devonish, Mr. President. And not Dr. Devonish, I believe it is Ms. Chandler. And sometimes the parents are simply unemployed, actively trying to find employment, not able to do so, and that will take them out of the home as well, Mr. President, in some instances. Or a child or parent could be suffering from the effects of substance abuse or have mental health issues that are physiological in nature, need counseling, therapy, rehabilitation, can't afford it. And so we see how they're caught in a vicious cycle. Mr. President, you know, sometimes when we're here, I guess it's natural for senators to try to score political points. But I want to make sure that there is no misrepresentation of what I am saying. I have never said, and I would never say, that only poor people's children get into trouble with the law. I would never say. I know where I grew up. I was not rich. I didn't even know if they were classifying me as middle class at the time. I was not 1%, Senator Morris. And children from all kinds of backgrounds get into trouble. The issue is resources. The issue is access. Being able to find somebody to represent you and to take care of the issue that you are facing, Mr. President. That's why some of our children go through the justice system and some of them don't because the parents go write a check to somebody or some bodies. A check for compensation, a check to a lawyer. That is why we have to discuss poverty. We have to discuss those kinds of issues when we look at this kind of legislation, Mr. President. And the data shows that a child from an underprivileged background is at a higher risk. We cannot self-righteously rubbish that idea. That would be disingenuous, Mr. President. And we're not preaching at anybody. We, in reflecting on this legislation, have to orient ourselves in the reality. And the government is setting policy must, and I would say, is conducting studies. It is doing consultations, so it is doing that. So orienting ourselves in the context cannot be rubbish either, Mr. President. I don't try to talk at poor people, and I don't just talk about them. I think everybody can see that I literally work for poor people in Barbados to help them with some of their economic issues. Because for me, these things are extremely important. For a lot of us in here, it's a case of there go I, but for the grace of God. Some people call it luck. Because you didn't have the financial resources, but something else kept you out of trouble, and sometimes it was simply an intervention, Mr. President. In our country today, we find that our hearts are hurting frequently, particularly in the last few weeks, it seems, Mr. President, daily, because we are seeing news report after news report after news report about a shooting or shootings, because in some instances, there are multiple shootings at the same time. Another death, another young Barbadian male gone. And I listened to this BLP administration talk about paying what we understand to be gang members not to kill, not to rampage in our society. I don't understand it. I have to tell you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, at times like this, I miss my father who spent his entire life in justice and law enforcement, because I would like to ask him what solutions he would offer in this situation. Because what we're getting is statistics, but we're not hearing a reflection from people with experience about solutions that should be offered. And I don't think he would say that that's the solution, but he would not say that only policing is the solution either, because he presided, Mr. President, over the DARE program, drug abuse resistance education. He oversaw community policing, Mr. President, and from a personal perspective, for many years, he served on the board of the Young Men's Christian Association, as an organization that has worked in our community for time immemorial. Probably could use some help, some resources, but it continues to do good work because those interventions matter. You meet the young person where that young person is, and that way you can help them, you get to them before they get into the system, Mr. President. We have a lot of work to do. I want to take a direct look at the bill. I'm not going to go through to slavishly articulate provisions. I want instead to focus on some of the key aspects that jump out at me. When we consider the Child Protection Bill, and Senator Cummins is right, they are linked. There are some similar provisions in there. There is the concept of an administrative penalty. Previously, I said that we're seeing this more and more, but we're not telling the people what it means. And that needs to happen. In this particular bill, we see that this device is used, you're imposed, an administrative penalty is imposed on you. You have not done what the law says you're supposed to do, and in this bill in particular, present the child to the court when you're requested to do so. And if you don't do it, a particular authority will impose a penalty on you. You pay that penalty. If you do not pay that penalty, then it is recoverable in the magistrate's courts, Mr. President. And other jurisdictions do it, so I'm not saying it can't be done or it mustn't. But what other jurisdictions tend to do is to have an opt-in process. You can say, when you get the notice, yes, I will pay. I am happy to receive the penalty. And if you say no, then the authority has to go through the system. They can't automatically impose a penalty on you, Mr. President. And that is what I think is unfair about the way that we are doing it, because we're asking people who we recognize are challenged to then have to go to a judge in chambers to appeal the penalty. Meanwhile, the penalty remains a debt enforceable by the state against the poor person. I don't understand that, Mr. President. Meanwhile, that person has to navigate the system, probably can't afford a lawyer, to find a way into a judge's chambers to appeal this administrative penalty. I would ask the government to flip that. Make that an opt-in provision, because the authority, the state that imposes that penalty, has the resources to take it through the system. They could decide not to take it through the system, but that person will carry that debt if they don't take it through the system. And so we have to look at who has the resources, who has the power. We have to look at that imbalance and have a heart, flip that administrative penalty mechanism to let a person opt in, and if they don't, then the state is tasked to pursue them. Well, that's midsection, I know. I note, Mr. President, in clause 3 of the bill, that there are certain rights detailed when a child is detained under the law. There's a longish list, and I want to read it so that I can clarify the problem that I'm going to raise. The clause in particular states, a child who is detained under this act shall have the right to adequate food and water, to medical treatment, to a reasonable number of visits by a parent, appropriate adult, attorney at law, social worker, probation officer, religious counselor. They have a right of access to reading material, a right to adequate exercise, a right to access to recreational activities, to access to suitable equipment and assistive devices where the child has a disability, and to adequate clothing. Mr. President, what's missing here? Because that list is long and it sounds good, it sounds like it's complete. What is missing, Mr. President, that I'm going to point out is in relation to the right to education. And I'm going to articulate it in this way. And Mr. President, it says a right to access to reading material. Education is not in that list, Mr. President. I do not understand that. I know Senator Morris will not understand it either. How could you not say that there's a right to education? Mr. President, this bill makes a specific reference to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That is a right under that convention. The bill makes a specific reference to the Riyadh Guidelines, the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for Administration of Juvenile Justice, the United Nations Rules for the Protection of Juveniles Deprived of their Liberty. That is their right. The right to education is also a right under those guidelines. How can the legislation refer to compliance to those international standards, and then we do not include that fundamental right, Mr. President? Under the rules for protection of juveniles deprived of their liberty, there is this rule, I quote, Mr. President, education, vocational training, and work. Every juvenile of a compulsory school age has the right to education suited to his or her needs and abilities and designed to prepare him or her for return to society. Such education should be provided outside the detention facility, in community schools wherever possible, and in any case by qualified teachers through programs integrated with the education system of the country that after release, juveniles may continue their education without difficulty. Special attention should be given by the administration of the detention facilities to the education of juveniles of foreign origin or with particular cultural or ethnic needs. Juveniles who are illiterate or have cognitive or learning difficulties should have the right to special education. Juveniles above compulsory school age who wish to continue their education should be permitted and encouraged to do so, and every effort should be made to provide them with access to appropriate educational programs. Diplomas or education certificates awarded to juveniles while in detention should not indicate in any way that that juvenile has been institutionalized. Every detention facility to provide access to a library that is adequately stocked, both with instructional and recreational books and periodicals suitable for juveniles who should be encouraged and enabled to make full use of it. Every juvenile should have the right to receive vocational training in occupations likely to prepare him or her for future employment. Again, Mr. President, I refer to the need for restorative justice. If the intention is to rehabilitate and reintegrate juvenile offenders, we have to ensure that their education continues up to standard. National, I know we criticize that, but it should not be disrupted. That's the point. While they are under the state's care and that their learning needs are met, will it cost us? Of course it will cost us, but we are taking these steps. So we must be prepared to put the resources in place, plan and execute and resource. And it is most definitely an investment worth making. And that leads me to the provisions related to a secure residential facility and what we commonly know as now as government industrial school. I expect that might be rebranded or has been, I can't recall. Also includes a facility for reception and rehabilitation of a child who requires psychiatric or psychological treatment or treatment for substance abuse. So that is a secure residential facility also, so that if that person is not at the industrial school and they are in a healthcare facility, they are to have all of the rights. That must include the right to education. And we have to do what is necessary to facilitate it, Mr. President. And looking at the secure residential facility, I also want to look at the provisions related to disciplining a child that is in residence at a facility. At Section 87 of the bill, it states, corporal punishment and cruel, inhuman, or degrading measures shall not be inflicted on a child in a secure residential facility. Good, we're satisfied with that. The director may impose disciplinary action on a child in a secure residential facility for any violation of or failure to comply with the provision of this act or regulations made under this act governing the conduct of the child in a secure residential facility. A director who, after considering the circumstances, determines that a child in a secure residential facility has committed an infraction shall impose one or more of the following forms of disciplinary action: verbal warning, reduction or suspension of privileges for a definite period of time. A director who, after considering the circumstances, determined that a child in a secure residential facility has committed an act of misconduct shall impose one or more of the following forms of disciplinary action: verbal warning, reduction or suspension of privileges for a definite period of time, payment of part or all of the cost of repairing the damage done by the child, performance of additional work, or confinement for a definite period of time to an area assigned by the director. Mr. President, I thought a lot about that provision. It's necessary to be able to discipline the child in the facility if they don't comply with the rules. What concerns me is, for me, this is somewhat high level. What do you mean by privileges? Because I look elsewhere in the act for that word and I don't see it. So is a privilege one of those rights that I talked about before, right to recreational activity, physical activity, et cetera, that provision is not good enough, Mr. President. It has to be detailed, and we cannot commence this act without that detail. I am very concerned about that provision, Mr. President, particularly when we know what has happened in our recent history at the government industrial school. And again, I will say, a privilege that cannot be taken away is education. They must have access to it, even if they're being disciplined, Mr. President. We know sometimes when you're disciplining your child, you feel that you will say you will not go to that activity that you like so much. But everybody says that is not discipline. That's a punishment. They're two different things. That will tell the child, it will send the wrong signal, Mr. President. So we have to be careful about what a director will adopt as a measure for discipline, and whether it works to discourage a child in a secure facility, or whether it works to have positive reinforcement of the behaviors that we want that child to adopt in that facility. And also missing, this one bothered me again. What is missing here also is the right to representation by an attorney or an adult next friend when that disciplinary process is occurring. Mr. President, adults being disciplined in Barbados in the workplace and elsewhere aren't told break for yourself. You can bring a next friend, your union, a representative, an attorney at law. How are we going to tell a child that can't defend itself, that is going to sit down with the director, and the director is going to say, did this little investigation, this person said this, and this is the discipline I'm going to impose on you? That is absolutely not satisfactory, Mr. President. The child must be able to get representation, and it cannot be controversial. This is not anything for anybody to oppose, because this bill, a few provisions below, says that a child can get an attorney if it wants to appeal the disciplinary action. So you recognize that that is a requirement, but you leave it out at the front end, so that a child then has to face the disciplinary action. It doesn't say it's going to be suspended neither, Mr. President. So you could be in the disciplinary action, including special confinement, want to appeal, and go find your way to an attorney, and none of those processes are detailed, as far as I can see them. That needs to be fixed, Mr. President. We are talking about child justice. The justice does not get suspended because they are in a secure facility. So you cannot talk about all the steps and all the reinforcement and all the padding that you've put in when they get into a court, but then when they get into the facility, those protections are not adequately put in place or provided for. That is a challenge that I have with this particular element of the bill. And because the child is in state care, we have to take special care, Mr. President. The bill necessarily requires reflection on what children in state custody must experience when their truth is ignored or minimized by caregivers. And the caregivers could be biased. The caregivers themselves could be in a situation where they don't know how to give care, and we have seen that. Nobody could dispute it. We saw it. We were all horrified in 2021, and it went abroad. I did a Google this week, and the first article I got was a Toronto article, and I felt bad because that was my country, Mr. President. So we have to take care, and we have to ensure that these ugly realities are minimized to a point where, if they exist at all, they are minimal, Mr. President. And in that regard, I reflected on the element of who gives care, who's responsible for it, care, guidance, control, etc., in a secure residential facility. And again, the conventions that we refer to pay close attention to that, Mr. President. And there's still no statutory requirement that I can see for background checks in either of these bills, Mr. President, not the child protection nor the child justice, for background checks or psychological evaluation to be undertaken for staff. I think that is necessary. Not only staff, but well, in the child protection bill, it should happen for foster parents. But in this bill, we have to ensure that children in state care are not prey, Mr. President. That is extremely important. And we often think about children being preyed upon from the perspective of sexual assault, but they can be preyed upon from all forms of abuse. And we have to protect against that. So we have to ensure that the people who work with them are adequately trained. First, you get the right people, but they have to be trained constantly, Mr. President. And so I refer to the UN Rules Protection of Juveniles Deprived of Their Liberty. And the requirement in that is that personnel should be qualified and should include a sufficient number of specialists, such as educators, vocational instructors, counselors, social workers, psychiatrists, and psychologists. These and other specialist staff should normally be employed on a permanent basis. There should be careful selection and recruitment of every grade and type of personnel, since the proper management of detention facilities depends on their integrity, humanity, ability, professional capacity to deal with juveniles, as well as personal suitability for work. No picks. No, just go out there and do the work. We have to also consider everybody that is on the plant, Mr. President, who comes on permanently and who is allowed to come on to do temporary work. We have to do the checks. It happens in other instances. We know that there are events that we cannot attend unless we give you a deed, and we even ask you for a police certificate of character, or they do their background check, and that is what we must be doing. But the convention says you must also train. Personnel should be appointed as professional officers with adequate remuneration to attract and retain suitable men and women. That's really important, because we could talk a lot about who we bring, but they have to want to do that job. They have to want to stay in that job. Nobody goes to work just for the love of it, except the senators, Mr. President. Nobody comes to do this. And it's not easy work. By no means do I expect it is, because they're going to be dealing with children in many instances who are violent. These situations will be fraught, tense, difficult, and they will be exposed from a personal safety perspective. So they have to want to come to work. So we have to look at the Maslow elements of this hierarchy of needs. Am I coming for bread and butter? Am I actualizing? At a minimum, can I live a good life when I walk out of the secure facility and go to my home and, you know, I'm living my daily life? That's important. We can't belittle that. I will not. And so when we look at the words on the page, we have to look behind those words and what are we going to do when we operationalize this legislation. It can't just sound good. In the doing, it has to be what we're trying to be, exceptional. I think we're trying to be exceptional. And the personnel should receive the training to enable them to carry out their responsibilities effectively, in particular training in child psychology, child welfare, and international standards and norms of human rights and the rights of the child, including the present rules. The personnel should maintain and improve their knowledge and professional capacity by attending courses of in-service training to be organized at suitable intervals throughout their career. Mr. President, let me tell you the word that excites me there. The word that excites me there is the word career, not job. I am committing to this. I have studied, I have chosen this. I am dedicating myself to it. It is my career. I'm going to go and work with these children. I actually don't think I have ever talked to a child psychologist who did not start out saying, I want to be a child psychologist. They don't go off there and do industrial psychology and sports psychology. Actually, I know a lot of sports psychologists who are child psychologists, but that's another issue. And they end up working in sports with children. But they want to work with children. And I think those are the kinds of yardsticks that we have to apply to what we are going to do when we operationalize this legislation. And the final thing that I will refer to, because it's linked to the issue of what happens with personnel, is that the bill establishes state-owned enterprises, boards that, when they're put into place, I'm not criticizing that. So we understand that we will have different agencies to help to manage this regime. But we must incorporate performance reviews, because we're not talking about widgets, we're talking about children. If you damage a child, we know, certainly for a child that's already at risk, how that will compound the problem, but we also know what the cost of recovery would be. And so we must accept that human resources management practices must be incorporated at the outset. We cannot say, oh, we don't do this in the public service and all of that. I don't think we can afford to do that here, because we can't just go and say we're going to revise a policy or change a process. We're talking about children. And so there must be a zero-tolerance approach to abuses, to non-performance, because we are talking about the care and protection, pursuit of justice for our most valuable resources, most valuable in the state's care, and we must go all out, Mr. President, to live the principles behind this bill and to take care of those most valuable resources. Mr. President, I am obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Senator King.
Senator Watson, Mr. President.
Us. Thank you very much, Senator Watson. I'm so sorry. Senator King.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. With your permission, before I get into my speech, I would like to have a little clarification. I heard the Honorable Senator before me make reference to government, gang leaders, and some sort of a payment. These are three things I heard. I didn't hear them in sequence. So before I go any further, I would like some clarification on what it is that the honorable member meant. Because what I heard may very well not be what she intended to say. So before I go any further, sir, I would like some clarity on that statement, please.
Not for me.
Through you, I would like Senator Watson. I didn't want to get on a point of order at a particular point in time because she was in stride.
That was a device by which you may have got it in. If the senator so chooses, she may elucidate. She could also choose not to elucidate.
Fine.
But the time to get clarity on matters on which there is not clarity is at the moment.
Thank you, sir. Okay, well, I will move on. But then I will repeat what I heard, and then she can tell me if I'm wrong. So if one suggests that the government is paying gang leaders to stop the violence or to combat the violence, I will be stunned if that is what it is. But nonetheless, sir, when we look at this particular bill, and I'm going to start off as one of the few people in this room who has years of experience working at government industrial schools. And I've heard a lot being said in this place, in the other place, and in the public sphere, which oftentimes compounds the problem that people actually do not know what they are speaking about when they talk about government industrial school. For many years, I have heard people say things such as, the staff members get up there unfair to children, the staff members do this and the staff members do all sorts of things. And they never have anything that speaks about the rights of the staff members at the place at all, even in this legislation, and I'll come to that. But I want to say this. The rules or the legislation that we used to work underneath were handed to us by our colonial government, if I want to use that term, who at that particular point in time did not take into consideration a lot of the things that we are now trying to address. And so therefore, that is what we had to work underneath. And this is the first thing that people are supposed to understand. We did not make those laws. They would say, in fact, 1926, if my memory serves me right. The Juvenile Act and the Reformatory Act, and these things were put in place. We're in 2024. And now, beginning the process of changing this legislation so that we become more empathetic, more sympathetic, more humane to ourselves. There was a time we had something called wandering, where a person could see a child on the street walking, and police could pick them up and bring them to government industrial school based on the fact that they were not with an adult or in care or whatever. Now, you could imagine if a child was walking, and I'm not saying that this has happened, but I'm just drawing a scenario. A child walking from its grandmother's house to its mother's house late in the night, which it shouldn't be, but it can happen for one reason or the other. And you could have, at that time, just pick up the child without any conversation with parents, anybody else, and carry it to the government industrial school. Now, I'm not saying that these things happened, but it could have happened at that particular point in time. So it is necessary that as we always talk about this new national consciousness, begin the process of changing a lot of the things that went before. Mr. President, I find that there were a number of things that were mentioned before, which I will not go over because I think they're very salient points, and I thank the Senator for them, because there are a lot of things that I have, in my own small way, spoken about for many, many years as to how we deal with things. But there's something that this country, not just senators, this country as a whole, continues to use as an excuse. And I hold a very different view on this. The whole idea of poverty. Now, there's no denying that poverty plays a role in people's behavior. Because at the very core of every single human being, there is the urge to survive. And the urge to survive is not driven by morals or ethics. It is driven by the urge to survive. And so therefore, a person who grows up in circumstances where there are challenges such as economical challenges, there are challenges even in terms of ethics and morals, the behavior, like all behaviors, is learned. So what else will you expect if you're in an environment where you have this urge to survive like everyone else? You have very limited resources in terms of money or access to money. You have no property, you have nothing, but you have to eat. You have to do all the other things that other people do. And then on top of it, you have an educational system, and I smiled when I heard the Honorable Senator talk about changing how we view education. Because I am one of few people who, in my own way, reject it. Because you had, especially when I was a young person, people who told me then, remember like yesterday, that when I passed the exam to go to law school, I should change my friends. The people I grew up with. I should change them. Because now you're a large boy. You can't walk up with these people that go to Princess Margaret or going to St. George Secondary School. A lot of nonsense. So it's interesting that we get to this part now, but we keep making the same mistake over and over and over, believing that only formal education will change or solve the problem. Ladies and gentlemen, please note that the man who created the atom bomb was a well-educated man. The man who decides that we want to have Star Wars, they are very well-educated people. The people who come up with economic systems that crush small island states like ours are well-educated. But they're still evil or antisocial. So it cannot be the realm of education alone. There's a conversation which we oftentimes run from. Because when you talk about it, it goes into the realm of being, in some people's mind, esoteric. Mr. President, if a society is not anchored in some sort of moral values, some sort of ethics, some code of conduct by which it carries itself, you can educate it all you like. It will still crumble and fall from the inside because it does not have a solid foundation of how it deals with its people and itself. And so when we are having the conversation about education, as all of the research continues to show that there is a link between criminal activity and lack of education, and I'm not denying it, because to deny it would be foolhardy. But I want us to also understand that there is a wider gamut of education that needs to be undertaken. And the more we refuse to look at it, the more we are going to face the problems of having young people in conflict with the law. It is interesting that a state, I don't remember which one it is, in the United States of America has now decreed that there must be the 10 Commandments in all of the schools and this sort of things on shore. Interesting. Very, 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 very interesting that this should be happening at this particular point in time. But I also go back to a problem that we have that, again, we refuse to look at. The disintegration of the family. And it is not just the nuclear family as we knew it, it is the family across the board. Where in an old African proverb, it took a village to raise a child. And you had those interventions. Look, let me draw my own life so that you get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. I came to this country in 1970 as a 6-year-old to live with my grandparents. My mother and father were in England. In that space where I live, there's a house to the left with my aunt, her husband, my cousins. To the right, there was another aunt with her husband, her cousins. The center was my grandmother's house where I live with another aunt, her husband, and her children. They weren't rich, not by any stretch of the imagination, but you had all of those interventions. Persons at different levels in age, persons at different levels in education, that would help to raise you, to give you an idea of how you speak to your grandmother, how you deal with the people within you, and how you deal with the people on the outside of your family. Who you are supposed to, if you see them on the road, speak to. When you go to school, how you are supposed to behave as you become a representative of this family. These are very simple things. They're not rocket science. It was a part and parcel of the barbarian living. We have lost these things. And through losing them, we've also lost the ability to take responsibility and to be accountable for a lot of the things that are happening with our young children. Now, this legislation, which seeks to better the experience of children coming in conflict with the law, that is the fundamental basis upon which all of this is done. Gives us the opportunity to, and I'll use this word, abide by conventions that we've already signed off on for many, many years. But it also gives us the ability to begin the process of breaking the cycle of discrimination that people who come into conflict with the law from a young age face for many years. I can tell you, Mr. President, as a person working in the government industrial schools, although it was called clear and plain, the government industrial schools, people refer to it all the time as a prison for children, which it was never designed to be, or it never was. So that when I hear people talking now about teachers and all sorts of things, the school has teachers already for many years. We have had students who have left the government industrial school and went on to university. We have had students who came out of the school and leave, and leave this country. Nobody had to leave this country because the society itself is so discriminates against them, can't find a job, can't do anything, right? They're ostracized as a Dodge boy or a Dodge girl. right? And so we've got to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how did we contribute to where we are today? This is because none of us can wash our hands clear of it and pretend that we can contribute to it. I talk about this in here already. I lived through an era where children who were having difficulties with education were sent out in the garden. That was me. Was sent out in the garden. So you put a stigma on agriculture. Now at 60 years old, I'm listening to people talking about doing things in agriculture. When you tell people, children, and tell them, go in gardening, you got a sense? Or in my case, go and sing and dance because you don't got a sense? Neither. It is mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling how in 2024 we're still having these conversations as opposed to how we ostracize people and then when the people react, we now got to react to. The important thing though, Mr. President, is that the steps are being taken, again, to ensure that those people who come into conflict with the law are given the best possible opportunity to not only have justice served, but how they should be handled and treated as children. You know, I have lived a very interesting life. Done a lot of different jobs, traveled, seen a lot of different things. But the one thing I know that used to serve Barbados well, which people, for some unknown reason, when they're ready, they will run to the Bible and pick up this word, pride, and destroy it as it being a bad thing. Barbadians had a certain amount of pride many, many years ago, especially when I was a youngster growing up. They took pride in a lot of things, took pride in keeping around them clean. We say things like cleanliness is next to godliness. And that clean didn't only mean a physical environment, it meant how your own deportment. It also spoke to your tongue, not out on the road, as people say, cussing and carrying on and all these kind of things. It was frowned upon. Certain behavior, stealing, or you could not dare, for many of us in here, you could not dare come home, even with a pencil that you bought from a friend of yours, and forget it. Your mother go to your bag, or whoever your guardian is, and ask a question, where this come from? Who does this belong to? And the next thing you know is that you carry it right back tomorrow, and don't let me see it in here again, or whatever it is. One of the problems we have, and I know that people keep saying all the time, okay, but if you're born in this particular environment, then you must operate like that environment. There are too many good stories of persons who were born in less than ideal conditions, who were able to rise above those things and do well for themselves. The unfortunate thing is that the press, and not pardon the pun, the depressed, can be depressing at times when you see a lot of the things that they write. They don't usually, and the Honorable Senator before me spoke about it, they don't oftentimes give any coverage to the good things that are happening amongst our young people. You know, we can see all the things with all the people who have been shot over the last month or so, and we continue to see, we don't see the good things that people are doing. And there needs to be balance in that conversation, because if you're only seeing one particular thing all the time, you begin to believe that this is all that is happening in Barbados. This is all that it's about. But there are a lot of other good things that are happening that we need also to have highlighted so that those other persons who might find themselves on the wrong side of the track can also see that when they do good things, that too is being promoted. Because in today's world, and the point was made earlier about social media and things, in today's world, for some strange and inexplicable reason, our young people believe that the whole world must know them. The whole world must know you. You go out to dinner, you say, better take a picture of it, put it up, look, me here at such and such a place, eating and carrying on. Why? For who? These things, these are, again, foreign values and foreign things that come into our country. Remember, Mighty Gabby sang a song, we talked about cultural penetration. We are suffering the effects of it right now. Barbados had a very strong culture. Half of the things that we're dealing with, having to build these kinds of residencies and put all of these things in place, it wouldn't happen. And I always ask one particular question. A lot of people get vexed when they ask it, but you ask it here now too, because that's the kind of person I am. Why is it that when we talk about all this and that happening all over the world, going to the Muslim states of this world, don't hear anything about it? Half of them you don't hear, and if they got the small, negligible. And then you will hear, oh, there's this Sharia law and this thing and the next thing, all kinds of things. But if we play for liberty, we got all the liberties in the world, so-called liberties. You have no control. But something has to be wrong. Something has to be wrong. And we would do well to begin to get back to the whole idea of the village raising the child, the values and ethics must be at the core of fighting the problems that we face. And I just wanted to make those points where that is concerned. But to get back to the substantive legislation here, a lot of it is, as I said earlier, to improve on a lot of things that were done in the past. And the Honorable Senator made the call for consistent training, and I would support that 100%, because as the world changes, people are always changing. And you're going to always find different challenges coming at you, things that we did not dream of when we were young people are normal today, and our young people face challenges that we would have never dreamed of when we were younger. There are some things that are staple, but then there are always new things. And you have to be constantly training people. She also mentioned the whole idea of psychological testing, if I put it that way, of people going into that. I dare say that psychological testing is not just for people going into work at places like government industrial school. Because, and she would know, because her dad was in the police force, people going into the police force, people going into the army, people going into customs, all of these points, you should also start thinking about that in terms of psychological testing, because there is such a thing as an antisocial personality. And I've said it in here before, and I will say it again. An antisocial personality, if it means that they have to go to school and get 49 PhDs to do the most damage in the world, they will do it. They will do it because that is how their mind works. That's how their mind works. And until we are able, even in schools, to begin to have assessment on children, understand the environments within which they come, because it seems to me, and I could be very wrong, but it seems to me that oftentimes we believe that because we had a certain upbringing, that everybody has it. It is not so. It is not so. And because you have a particular kind of value system within your household, there are other persons who have something completely different. And you have to be able to not only at the back end, then got to deal with the problem, but I guess the old people always used to make the point of prevention is better than cure. We need to be able to start thinking in terms at the primary school level, that we begin the process of really having the social workers and psychologists or whoever else is needed on call, that you can deal with some of the problems as they arise there. The other thing is the sharing of information in this time. I can tell you, again, working within the system, if the sharing of information between the various agencies is not good, you can still have a lot of unnecessary problems in the same facilities that you're going to put the children in. And I've seen it before where, and I wouldn't say what happened, but I would draw a simple analogy so you get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. You have a place like government industrial school, a person comes to it, all you know is that this person went to court on a particular charge or whatever it was, and was remanded to you. So they remanded for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is. But the person says, you know, I would always love to learn how to cook. Why? I just want to learn how to cook. I've never done it. And you thinking that maybe, you know, this might be a good opportunity to put this person in a direction, you know, start them off so that later on we want to become a chef, but not knowing that this person is an arsonist. You don't know. What you know is you got a young person in front of you, very interested in want to be a cook, not knowing that they're really looking to cook you. So I say that, it might sound like a joke, but it is very, very, very possible, from not sharing information, by not simply sharing information, very possible. So that as we go through these, and a lot of what the Honorable Senator before me spoke about are policy matters that can be taken up outside of the legislation, in my mind. A lot of the actual day-to-day things that need to be done to go into the actual policy, the place when those are developed. But we are on the right track. There's still a lot that has to be done, but I will go back to the point of prevention is better than cure. There has never, ever been, to the best of my knowledge, any manual that spoke to parenting when I was a youngster. All of us in this room, and forgive me for those of you who do not have this experience, I apologize. But in my mind, all of us would have learned our parenting skills from the environment from which we came, from our grandparents, parents, and those around us. Everything ain't gonna be right. There are some things that, growing up, senators, that you know that when you're not gonna do it with your children. you know what I mean? But it may have been your experience. And you learn from it, and you say to yourself, well, when I have kids, I definitely will not put them through X, Y, Z. But the people around you would have been the ones who, given what they knew in terms of parenting, that's what they did. And so we have to see this bill and all the things that it's trying to do in a positive light. Like I said, everything's not going to be correct because the world, again, continues to change at a rapid pace around us. And things that we would figure we would never be involved in when we were young, not so for a lot of younger people today. The only things that I really had some concern about, and that is in this conversation about child justice and child protection, as a person who worked in the system, there's very little that speaks to the protection of the people who have to work with these children. And because the children are not like children of the past, and I want to make this clear in this chamber, you can have a situation, if you are not careful, where a staff member is either severely damaged or can die at the hands of an aggressive child. And it has nothing to do with size or none of those things. And I believe that there's some things, and again, the policy manuals for these things, when there are things that we have to have some further discussions on as it relates to how the persons who will deal with children, not only just in the facilities and stuff, but also how police have to handle them and these kind of things, because times are very different. If you have young people who are members of gangs, young, we are in such, what's the word I'm looking for? Unusual times. That is, it's not far-fetched, because the movies usually are the precursor to the actual reality that we end up facing. We are in territory where young people who may be involved in gangs may also be able to put a hit out on you. It is worth thinking about. So, Mr. Speaker, I've taken up my time and I wouldn't want to go beyond, but here is to say that I fully support this legislation and I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the suspension of this sitting of the Senate until 2:30 p.m. for lunch break.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:30 p.m. today. Will those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The next, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the Senate is suspended until 2:30 p.m. today.